The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who wouldn't make eye contact as he handed over the thick envelope embossed with the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association seal. Marcus Washington stood in the doorway of the ranch house his great-grandfather had built in 1889, holding paper that claimed he was in violation of community standards and faced immediate legal action if he didn't comply with HOA regulations within 30 days. The absurdity would have been comical if it wasn't so dangerous. The ranch house, weathered wood and stone that had survived 134 years of Texas weather, sat on land that Marcus's family had owned since Reconstruction. 500 acres of rolling prairie that his great-grandfather Samuel Washington had purchased with money saved from years of sharecropping, land that had been in the family longer than most of the states west of the Mississippi had been states. And now, according to this letter, Marcus was in violation of architectural standards set by a homeowners association that hadn't existed until 18 months ago. The letter detailed his offences with the kind of bureaucratic precision that transforms common sense into legal harassment. His ranch house was not in compliance with approved architectural styles. His barn, a historic structure that had housed horses and equipment for over a century, was an unauthorized outbuilding requiring removal or modification. His fence line was improperly maintained and aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. Community standards for a community built on land that had been stolen from his family. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of audacity. The HOA demanded he repaint his house in approved neutral tones. They required removal of his part of the Washington Ranch agricultural structures or payment of fines, total being $50,000. They insisted he replace his split-rail fence with modern privacy fencing consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. They wanted him to erase 134 years of history to match houses that had been built last year. The signature at the bottom belonged to Richard Thornton III, HOA president and CEO of Thornton Development Group, the same company that had built Meadowbrook Estates on 300 acres of land that bordered Marcus's ranch, land that Marcus's grandfather had been forced to sell in 1962 when the local bank had called in loans they'd never properly documented, when courthouse records had mysteriously disappeared, when white lawyers had explained with patronizing patience that a black family's claim to land wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. The theft had been legal because the law itself had been a weapon. Marcus's grandfather Thomas had fought the seizure, had hired lawyers who took his money and delivered nothing, had watched as 300 acres of his inheritance were sold at auction for a fraction of their value. Thomas had died 5 years later, and Marcus's father swore the loss had killed him. Not physically, but spiritually, the kind of death that happens when a man loses everything he'd worked for and realizes the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. But Thomas Washington hadn't been a man who accepted defeat quietly. In the months before the land was seized, Thomas had done something that everyone assumed was just the bitter gesture of a defeated man. He'd hired a surveyor, had property lines professionally marked, had documentation prepared and filed with the county in ways that seemed redundant and unnecessary at the time. Marcus's father had kept those documents in a fireproof safe, along with the original deed from 1889 signed by Samuel Washington, along with tax records and surveys and letters and photographs that documented 134 years of continuous family ownership. One day, his father had told Marcus before he passed, "Someone's going to try to take what's left, and when they do, your great-grandfather left you something better than land. He left you the truth, documented so well that even thieves will have to acknowledge it." Marcus had assumed his father meant lawyers or banks, another attempt to steal the remaining 200 acres through illegal maneuvering and manufactured debt. He hadn't expected a homeowners association. He walked through the ranch house to the office where his father's safe sat in the corner, its combination unchanged since 1975. Inside were documents that Marcus had examined dozens of times, family history preserved in yellowing paper and fading ink. But today he was looking for something specific. The survey Thomas Washington had commissioned in 1961, right before the seizure. The property boundaries marked with such precision that 3 different firms had verified the measurements. The easements and rights-of-way documented with the kind of detail that suggested Thomas had known something, had seen something coming, had prepared for a fight that would extend beyond his lifetime. Marcus pulled out the survey and spread it across his desk, comparing it to the modern plat map of Meadowbrook Estates that he'd obtained from the county assessor last year, when the development had first broken ground. And there it was. The thing his great-grandfather had seen, had documented, had preserved for exactly this moment. The property line between Washington Ranch and what was now Meadowbrook Estates didn't run where Thornton Development thought it ran. The survey from 1961 showed that 10 acres of land, including the main entrance to Meadowbrook Estates, the clubhouse, and 17 of the development's luxury homes, had never actually been part of the seized property. Those 10 acres had been specifically excluded from the 1962 sale through a legal mechanism so obscure that the lawyers handling the seizure had apparently missed it entirely. Thomas Washington had deeded those 10 acres to his church in 1960, with a clause stating that ownership would revert to the Washington family if the church ever sold or abandoned the property. The church had sold the land in 1995, 45 years after the deed was signed, which meant that legally, technically, and irrevocably, those 10 acres had belonged to Marcus's family for the past 28 years, and nobody had noticed because Thomas Washington had been very, very careful about how he'd structured the deed, about which documents he'd filed where, about creating a paper trail that wouldn't be discovered until someone, like a developer building a luxury subdivision, started demanding architectural compliance from the family that actually owned the land they'd built on. Marcus felt his hands shaking as he pulled out more documents, each one confirming what his great-grandfather had done: the deed restriction, the church sale records, the automatic reversion clause, the survey markers that were still in the ground if anyone bothered to look. Thornton Development had built a multi-million-dollar subdivision on land they didn't own, and they'd just sued the rightful owner for not complying with their aesthetic standards. The trap that Thomas Washington had set 62 years ago was finally springing closed. Marcus spent the next week with lawyers, 3 different firms that specialized in property law, real estate disputes, and civil rights litigation. Each one reached the same conclusion. His case was ironclad, his documentation was flawless, and Thornton Development had made a catastrophic error. "This is extraordinary," said Margaret Chen, a property attorney who'd handled landmark cases involving disputed land claims. "Your great-grandfather essentially created a time bomb in the property records. He knew the land would eventually be developed, knew whoever bought it wouldn't do proper title research, and he set up a mechanism that would allow your family to reclaim it generations later." "Can they fight it?" Marcus asked. "They can try," Margaret replied, "but fighting facts is expensive and usually futile. The deed is clear. The reversion clause is unambiguous. The survey markers are still in the ground. I had them verified yesterday. Thornton Development built on land they don't own, and they have no legal recourse except to negotiate with you." Marcus thought about Richard Thornton III, standing in the clubhouse that existed on stolen land, drafting HOA violations for the man who actually owned the property beneath his feet. The irony was so perfect it felt like justice had a sense of humor. "What are my options?" Marcus asked. Margaret smiled the way lawyers smile when they're holding a royal flush. "Anything you want. You could demand they remove every structure on those 10 acres, demolish the clubhouse, relocate 17 homes. You could sue for decades of lost use and rental value. You could negotiate a sale at current market rates, which would be somewhere around $40 million. Or you could do what I suspect you're thinking about doing." "What's that?" "Make them live under rules they set for others. Make them comply with standards they tried to impose on you. Make them understand what it feels like to have someone else control their property." Marcus met with Thornton Development the following Tuesday in the same clubhouse that sat on his family's land. Richard Thornton III had brought his corporate counsel, a property attorney, and an air of superiority that suggested he still believed this was a negotiation between equals. "Mr. Washington," Thornton began, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension reserved for people he considered beneath him, "I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly. Our legal team has reviewed your documents, and while there may be some historical complications, I'm confident we can reach an arrangement." "I own your house," Marcus interrupted quietly. "I own your main entrance. I own 17 of your homes. Not historically, not theoretically, right now, today, legally and completely." Thornton's smile faltered. "That's a rather aggressive interpretation." "It's the correct interpretation," Margaret Chen stated, sliding a thick folder across the conference table. "Every document you need to verify the claim is in there. Original deed from 1889, church transfer in 1960, reversion clause, church sale in 1995, survey markers verified last week by 3 independent firms. Your title insurance company already received copies, and they've confirmed they won't cover this because proper title search would have revealed the defect." The color drained from Thornton's face as his attorney opened the folder and began reading. Marcus watched the man's expression transform from confidence to confusion to horror as he processed what he was seeing. "This can't be right," Thornton's attorney muttered. "The title search was insufficient," Margaret finished. "The deed restriction was filed in a different county because that's where the church was located. The reversion clause was structured in a way that wouldn't appear in standard title searches. Mr. Washington's great-grandfather was extremely thorough in creating a mechanism that would be nearly impossible to discover unless someone knew exactly where to look." "But we've invested," Thornton started. $67 million, Marcus said. "I know. I read the development prospectus. $67 million building on land you don't own, sold homes to families under false pretenses, and created an HOA to govern property that belongs to me." The room fell silent, except for the sound of pages turning as Thornton's attorney continued reading, his expression growing more grim with each document. "What do you want?" Thornton finally asked, and his voice had lost all its previous superiority. Marcus pulled out the HOA violation letter he'd received, smoothed it on the table. "You sent me this, told me my ranch house, built in 1889, doesn't meet your architectural standards, told me my barn needs to be removed, told me to replace fences that are older than your grandfather. That was... We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care," Marcus interrupted. "You saw a black man on a ranch and assumed I was the one who didn't belong. Assumed you could use your HOA and your lawyers and your authority to push me out. Assumed that because your development is worth millions, my family's history is worth nothing." He stood, walked to the window that overlooked Meadowbrook Estates, the manicured lawns and identical houses and luxury cars that represented everything Thornton had built on stolen land. "My great-grandfather bought this land in 1889, former slave who saved every penny, who learned to read in secret, who understood that land was freedom and freedom was everything. My grandfather had 300 acres stolen from him by banks and lawyers, and a legal system that treated black ownership as temporary and conditional. Marcus turned back to face Thornton. But my great-grandfather was smarter than the men who tried to rob us. He saw this coming. He prepared for it. He left a trap in the property records that would spring closed the moment someone tried to take what was left. Mr. Washington, Thornton tried again, I'm prepared to offer generous compensation. I don't want your money, Marcus said quietly. I want you to understand what you did. I want every resident of Meadowbrook Estates to know they're living on land that was stolen from a black family and never properly returned. I want your HOA to acknowledge that the authority you claimed never existed because you don't own the property you tried to control. But what Marcus didn't reveal in that meeting, what he was saving for exactly the right moment, was something even his lawyers didn't fully understand yet. Because while researching his family's property claims, Marcus had discovered something else in those meticulously preserved documents, something that went beyond the 10 acres Thornton had built on, something that would change everything. The original land seizure in 1962 had been based on documents that claimed Thomas Washington owed money to First County Bank, but Marcus had found the original loan papers and they told a different story. The loans had been paid off in 1959, 3 years before the seizure. Cancelled checks, bank receipts, letters confirming zero balance. Thomas Washington had paid every penny he owed. But when Thomas went to the courthouse to retrieve his paid-off deed, he had been told the records were missing, lost, unavailable, the same courthouse where the bank president's brother was county clerk. So the bank had foreclosed on loans that didn't exist, seized land that wasn't collateral, and sold property at auction to buyers who'd been told they were getting a legal sale. It wasn't just theft, it was fraud. Systematic, documented criminal fraud. And because there's no statute of limitations on fraud when it's discovered, the entire 1962 sale was legally void, which meant Thornton Development didn't just build on 10 acres they didn't own. They'd purchased 300 acres that had never legally left Washington family ownership. Every home in Meadowbrook Estates, every street, every utility line, every square inch of the development. All of it was built on land that still belonged legally, completely, and irrevocably to Marcus Washington. Marcus had known for 2 weeks, had confirmed it with 3 different law firms, had documentation so thorough that even Thornton's corporate attorneys had advised immediate settlement. But he'd waited to reveal this final piece because he understood something his great-grandfather had taught him through those carefully preserved documents. Justice delayed is still justice, especially when it arrives with the weight of history behind it. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday, mandatory attendance for all residents of Meadowbrook Estates. Thornton had sent the notices trying to maintain control, trying to present this as a minor property dispute requiring community input. But word had spread. Local news had picked up the story. Local ranch owner discovers HOA built on his land. And it had exploded into national coverage. Civil rights organizations had reached out. Property law experts were writing articles. The story had everything: historical injustice, corporate fraud, a trap set by a freed slave that had taken 60 years to spring. The clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, with residents spilling into hallways and doorways. Local news cameras lined the back wall. Marcus arrived with his legal team, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would reshape everything these people thought they knew about their homes. Richard Thornton stood at the front, looking like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. He called the meeting to order with a shaking voice, tried to present the situation as a complicated property matter requiring negotiation. That's when Marcus stood and walked to the front. "Mr. Thornton is lying to all of you," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "This isn't a minor property dispute. This is the result of systematic fraud that stretches back 63 years. He projected documents onto the screen. The original deed from 1889, the paid-off loan receipts from 1959, the fraudulent foreclosure from 1962, the church deed and reversion clause, the survey showing exactly where Thornton had built on Washington land. My great-grandfather Samuel Washington bought 500 acres in 1889, former slave, self-educated, determined to own land because he understood that in America, land is freedom. His son Thomas expanded the ranch, raised cattle, paid every bill on time. Marcus pulled up the bank documents. In 1962, First County Bank foreclosed on loans that had been paid off 3 years earlier. They seized 300 acres based on debt that didn't exist. They sold the land at auction to buyers who thought they were getting a legal sale. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My grandfather fought back, hired lawyers who took his money and delivered nothing, died 5 years later from what my father called a broken heart. But before he lost that fight, he did something brilliant. He preserved the truth. Every document, every receipt, every piece of evidence showing the seizure was fraud. The screen changed to show modern surveys overlaid on historical documents. Thomas Washington deeded 10 acres to his church in 1960 with a reversion clause that would return ownership to our family if the church ever sold. The church sold in 1990, which means I've owned those 10 acres for 28 years. He pointed to the screen where the clubhouse, entrance, and 17 homes were highlighted. That's what Thornton Development built on land they didn't own. That's why they're legally exposed. That's why their title insurance won't cover this. The residents were murmuring now, looking at each other with growing alarm. But that's not the full story, Marcus continued, and the room fell silent. Because while researching my family's property, I discovered something else. The entire 1962 foreclosure was based on fraudulent documents. The loans had been paid off. The seizure was illegal, which means the entire sale was void. He let that sink in for 3 seconds that felt like eternity. Thornton Development didn't just build on 10 acres of Washington land. They purchased 300 acres that never legally left my family's ownership. Every home in Meadowbrook Estates is built on land that still belongs to me. The room erupted, raised. Ents shouting questions, Thornton trying to speak over the chaos, lawyers conferring in urgent whispers, news cameras capturing every moment of the revelation. Marcus waited for the noise to settle, then spoke again. "I could demand you all leave. I could sue for decades of lost use. I could demolish everything and restore the land to ranch property. Legally, I have that right." Fear swept through the crowd like wildfire. "But I'm not going to do that," Marcus said, "because unlike the men who stole from my grandfather, I understand that you're not the thieves. You bought homes believing they were legally sold. You invested your savings, built your lives here. The fraud isn't yours." Relief mixed with confusion on faces throughout the room. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued. "Thornton Development is going to buy this land from me at current market value, approximately $120 million. That sale will include proper title transfer, making every home sale legitimate. Residents will receive clear title to their properties." Thornton looked like he might faint. "In addition," Marcus said, "Thornton Development will establish a foundation with $20 million to preserve African American property rights and provide legal assistance to families facing fraudulent land seizures. They'll fund it for 20 years. We can't possibly," Thornton started. "You can and you will," Margaret Chen interrupted, standing beside Marcus. Because the alternative is we void every sale, file criminal fraud charges based on the 1962 seizure, and let your corporation collapse under the weight of the largest property fraud case in state history. Your choice, Mr. Thornton. The room waited while Thornton conferred with his attorneys, watched his empire of certainty crumble into a choice between catastrophic loss and merely devastating loss. "We'll agree to the terms," Thornton finally said, each word sounding like surrender. 3 months later, Marcus stood on the porch of his great-grandfather's ranch house, watching the sun set over land that had finally, legally and permanently been returned to Washington family ownership. The check had cleared. The foundation had been established. Every resident of Meadowbrook Estates had received corrected deeds showing they now owned their homes legitimately, purchased from the rightful owner rather than from thieves who'd stolen from a black family 60 years ago. The local newspaper had featured the story on the front page. Historic justice, Washington Ranch restored after 60-year flood. Or missing, national news had covered it. Civil rights organizations had cited it as proof that documentation and persistence could overcome even systematic racism embedded in legal systems. But for Marcus, the victory was more personal than headlines could capture. He pulled out a photograph from 1889, yellowed and fragile, showing Samuel Washington standing in front of this same ranch house. Former slave turned landowner, holding a deed that declared his freedom in the only language America's power structures understood, property ownership. Beside Samuel in the photo stood his son Thomas, young and determined, and beside Thomas, barely visible, was a boy who would grow up to become Marcus's grandfather, the man who would have everything stolen from him but would preserve the evidence of that theft so perfectly that justice would eventually arrive. "You did it, great-grandfather," Marcus said to the photograph, to the man who'd set a trap that took 62 years to spring. "You saw them coming. You documented everything. You left us the truth, preserved so well that even thieves had to acknowledge it." His phone rang. Margaret Chen calling with news that 2 other families had reached out, inspired by Marcus's case, believing they too had land stolen through fraudulent foreclosures. They had documentation. They had evidence. They wanted to fight. "I'll help them," Marcus told Margaret. "That's what the foundation is for." Because that was the real victory, not the money or the land, but the proof that systematic injustice could be overturned when someone was patient enough and thorough enough and determined enough to preserve the truth until the right moment arrived. Thornton Development had tried to use their HOA to erase 134 years of Washington family history to replace a ranch house built by freed slaves with cookie-cutter luxury homes to impose their aesthetic standards on land they'd stolen. Instead, they'd triggered the trap that Thomas Washington had set generations ago. They'd awakened documentation that had been waiting patiently for someone to be arrogant enough, careless enough, audacious enough to try taking what was left, and that documentation had destroyed them. Marcus walked down to the property line where new fence posts marked the boundary between Washington Ranch and what was now legally purchased land. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates had been transformed from unknowing accomplices to legitimate homeowners. Some had apologized for benefiting from stolen land. Others had joined the foundation as donors. The community that had tried to erase history had instead been forced to acknowledge it, to reckon with it, to understand that justice delayed is still justice when it arrives with the full weight of the law. A car pulled up the long driveway. Marcus's daughter Sarah, driving home from law school, where she was studying property law and civil rights. She'd been 8 years old when her great-grandfather died, had listened to stories about the stolen land, had grown up understanding that some fights take generations. "Dad," she called out, walking toward him with a manila folder, "Professor Martinez wants to write about great-grandfather's case. Use it to teach future lawyers about property fraud and documentation." Marcus smiled. "Tell him yes, tell him everything. Tell him that's exactly what Thomas Washington would want, for his trap to teach others how to set their own." Sarah stood beside her father, looking at the same land that Samuel Washington had purchased in 1889, that Thomas Washington had protected with careful documentation in 1961, that Marcus Washington had reclaimed in 2024. "Do you think great-grandfather knew?" Sarah asked. "When he was setting up the deed and the reversion clause, do you think he knew it would work?" Marcus considered this. "I think he knew that truth survives lies if you preserve it carefully enough. I think he knew that justice moves slowly, but arrives eventually, and I think he knew that the best revenge against people who try to steal your history is to make that history indestructible." The sun had set fully now, painting the Texas sky in shades of amber and crimson that matched the colors in that photograph from 1889. 5 generations of Washington family ownership, unbroken despite every attempt to sever it, preserved by a man who'd been born enslaved and had died knowing his family's freedom was documented too thoroughly to be stolen permanently. The HOA had built on his ranch. They'd demanded compliance with their standards, their rules, their vision of what belonged. They hadn't known they were building on a trap. They hadn't known that beneath every foundation they poured was documentation that would destroy them. They hadn't known that Thomas Washington had set a legal time bomb in 1961 that would detonate the moment someone was arrogant enough to demand a black family erase their history. The trap had closed exactly as designed, just as good city. Tice had arrived exactly as planned, and the land that Samuel Washington had purchased with freedom money, that Thomas Washington had protected with perfect documentation, that Marcus Washington had reclaimed through his great-grandfather's trap, that land would remain in Washington family hands forever. Not because of goodwill or mercy or changed hearts, but because Thomas Washington had understood something fundamental about America. Power respects only documentation, and justice belongs to those patient enough to preserve the truth until the right moment arrives. That moment had arrived. The trap had closed. And this time, history would not be stolen.